Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. We've recently launched our Patreon page, which can be found at cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon. If you aren't familiar with Patreon, it's an easy way for those who are interested in this show to help out by simply pledging a small amount each month in sponsorship. Now that could be as little as $5 a month, which is about £3.80, or as much as you like. You will enable us to dedicate more time creating more content to help you, including videos, more blog posts, and even more shows. So if you can, head over to cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon and get involved. In this episode, we talked to Jared Faris about progressive web apps, or PWAs. Jared is a Microsoft MVP with the VP of Technology and Solutions at HMB, and IT services company based in Columbus, Ohio. His focus is on building great development teams through training, mentoring, and prestigious amounts of caffeine. Just like every other developer out there, turning caffeine into code. He spent years building web applications with cloud and mobile experience. Jared helps organise Stir Trek, Cloud Develop, and Dog Food conferences as well as a variety of other events in and around Columbus, and is a frequent speaker at regional events. So welcome to the show, Jared.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for taking your time out of your day to come and talk to us about, I would say, probably the most up-to-date bit of tech that we're going to talk about. I think this is pretty cutting-edge, bleeding-edge, more than cutting-edge, I would say. It's just that little bit further on.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing where, depending on what device you have or what browser you're using and what day it is, it works to varying degrees, but it makes it fun too.
Yeah, it takes me back to when I started web development, where there was all this cool stuff that you could do, but you couldn't do any of it if you were doing a client-facing website because everybody was using Internet Explorer, and we get a little bit of that with this, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the case, and it might be worth. There's a little bit of a difference now, and that's the progressive aspect that I think makes it kind of exciting. Because I remember those same days where you had to use a library like jQuery because otherwise your code wouldn't work on half the devices.
Yeah.
So I think we've at least learned some lessons, and it's a little bit different world, but there's still definitely some pieces of that.
Sure. So PWA, or progressive web app, is going to be, I would imagine, a very new term for the vast majority of you out there that are listening to this podcast. So, like we normally do, we're going to go straight in with what is a progressive web app.
So the way I like to describe this is I like to talk about some of the problems that are out there, and then tie progressive web apps in as a solution.
Sure.
So
Okay.
At their core, they're not like a thing. They're not a standards body thing where you say HTML5. It's a bundle of technologies that solve a problem, and the problem is sort of the app landscape, especially in mobile, but in general, is kind of terrible. There's 10 million apps in each app store. Their discoverability is bad. People don't go to the app store and just kind of randomly browse a lot of times. If they get an app, it's because somebody told them, hey, go download this one in particular, or they Google what's the best finance app or something like that.
Yeah.
But the web solved discoverability a long time ago. It's really easy to Google and find sites. The web has bookmarks, and you can share links. Like, sharing is just kind of built into the web. But we built apps because we needed support for hardware acceleration or access to push notification or vibration or just different features of a device. So we had to build apps to do that. And we have we use native languages to build that. So now we have to have our website plus our Android app plus our iOS app. And that's not great from a developer experience. From a business standpoint, it's expensive. So the idea behind progressive web apps is to say, what if we took the web application you're going to build anyway, because in almost every case you have one, and then we progressively enhance that. So that's the concept of saying, it's a web app, and then if you allow it to do more things, it'll have access to those. So if your device supports it, if the browser supports it, your standard web app can now have offline support and background syncing. And then, maybe one day if your application supports it, we'll let you do push notifications and vibrations. And just basically as your device and browser opens up features, or you as a user agree to features, the app you're building, the web technology you're building, can just take those features and use that functionality and progressively enhance itself to be more and more like an app. And at the end of the day, you can have an experience that I think could be pretty compelling. Like, let's say you go to a news site every day. You load it in your browser, you Google, because people don't type in URLs directly, they just type in, NY Times. Google comes up with the first result, you click it, you read it. You do that a couple days in a row, your phone can notice that and say, hey, do you want me to save this to your home screen?
Yep.
And you say, oh yeah, that's a nice experience, I'll do that. So now I have an icon, and if we have this kind of PWA ecosystem built out, when I load that icon up, it could start to do app-like things. Like it could prefetch stories so that it knows I'm probably going to read the first 5 stories. It could download those in the background. And then if I go offline, or I'm in the subway and I don't have connectivity and I touch the story, it still loads up. And it could do things like maybe sharing across other devices using the sharing functionality on your phone, and that kind of app-like stuff, but still under the hood just be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that's kind of the vision.
Yeah. So it's like a full-blown application without the heartache of having to learn Swift or Objective-C and Java, and then Xamarin or something else to go and build this app. As you said, it's a nightmare for businesses to go and build 2 or 3 applications just for their one real app. It's a bit of a sidestep, and it says, well, we'll just build it all with this progressive web app technology.
Yeah, and our user experience, just like responsive web apps, the user experience can be consistent across them all. So the worst case scenario is your mobile app works totally different than your website, or one of them's updated and the other one's not. Sure. But even more powerful, I mean, the web is just a powerful place, and there's a lot of functionality that is just there, and it's kind of a shame not to use that, right? And as browsers are adding more and more functionality in, I mean, there could be a point where there's things you could do on the web that are hard to do in a mobile app.
Yeah.
So this could be down the road. I mean, this could be where everything goes.
Sure. And just sticking with that cross-platform thing, some of the UIs for the cross-platform applications and that make it mimic the UI on the device. So if you're on an iPhone, it looks like an iPhone app. If you're on an Android device, it looks like an Android app. Do you get that sort of functionality with a progressive app or not?
You don't out of the box, because the pieces that make up a progressive web app, which we should probably talk about, like service workers and caching, they're all kind of under the hood. But it's just a web application. So you can easily have style sheets that say, say maybe you're styled, maybe where your menu is at the top or the bottom, depending on the device, or things like that. And so I think you're going to start to see component libraries that do some of that for you. If you guys, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with Cordova or PhoneGap, but there's component libraries for that, like Ionic, that feel very native, and those are usually just a bundle of CSS and JavaScript, and you can use those controls potentially. Or I think as time goes on, we'll see other ones that come out that are just built for this.
Yeah. Sure.
So I think it depends. I think some apps, like or some pieces of the user experience, you want to change per device, but then plenty of companies also have their look and feel, and because it's the web and it's just styles, you can do either.
Do what you want, yeah.
Yep.
So you also mentioned as well that the PWAs can work online and offline. So how is that possible? Because from coming at it that it's a website, surely you need an internet connection for all of these things to work.
Well, you definitely need one at some point. So the way this works is through a feature called service workers. And so service workers are a proxy or a middleware that sits underneath your application and can do networking stuff. So the basic, and it's always fun to describe code without showing it. Basic idea here is it's a bit of JavaScript.
Yep.
You do a check and say, hey, does this browser support a service worker? If it does, you tell it to, you point it to a file and say install that file, and then you sort of just kind of hijack network requests. And so there's a new way of doing AJAX called the Fetch API, which is a standard way of doing requests. And you would listen for that, and you say, okay, my service worker is going to listen for a fetch event, and when there is one, it's going to do something. So the simplest thing it could do is just take that fetch event and send it off. But then there's a new caching API, which is for caching HTTP requests and responses. And you can say, hey, if the request matches one of these files, check the cache, and if it's in cache, return it. And if it's not, go ahead and get it and then store it. So now you can do something like my first time my application loads up, it's going to do a whole bunch of gets, and it's going to download all the images I have and the style sheets and the other JavaScript files, but it's going to stick them all in the cache API. And then the next time I load my app, it's almost instantaneous. A network request could take 100 milliseconds. A cache request could take 1 millisecond, or it's so fast that users don't even notice.
Sure.
And then you can do intelligent things around aging out things based on how long they've been in there, or parts of your application. You could say, if I'm online, get the newest version, and then if that fails, go to the cache. You can do kind of advanced network management with the service worker.
Right, yeah. So sticking with the news app analogy, I guess if you open that up, when I go to my news app, it shows me the top 10 news articles at that time. That when you first hit it, because I've still got internet connection at this point, it might go and download all 10 of those applications, store it in with this caching API, and then if I go out of the office or I lose connection for some reason, I can still flick through and read all of those top 10 connections because it's going out and hitting this cache rather than trying to do the request direct out to the server.
Yeah, exactly right. And it may, maybe there's the live news ticker, you turn it off if you're not connected, so it hides. But the stories are in there. And the cache API would store, each article has a URL. It basically would just store whatever's in that URL. You also have access to this thing called indexed DB, which is like a local storage type of thing that the service worker can write to. So you could pull entire pages down with all of their assets and cache them. You also could call like a REST API, pull back a bunch of JSON, and store that in IndexedDB for usage. So if it doesn't make, if your application is more of like a single page app and you're not doing full gets, you could, or you only want certain resources, you could pull those in as well. So your offline application is probably a combination of pages you're caching, style sheets, images, and data you might be caching and manipulating. And it's not just for reading, right? It might be you want to post a comment on the story and then have it send when you're back online as well. And so you could store that comment in the indexed DB. And then when you go back online, have your application become aware of that and then sync that up to the server.
Right. Yeah, so it'd be a bit like the Facebook app, I know, does it. You go to post a question or you go to post up your photo or whatever it is that you're doing, and a reply to a comment rather than a question, I think is what I meant. But if you lose your network connection at that point, it will come up and says something like, this will appear online next time you connect. So it's holding on to that, but that's obviously a full application.
It's exactly like that. And so there's a sync event that your service worker can listen to. And when you would basically say, I'm going to do this thing, and I'm going to attach it to a sync event. And if it succeeds, we're done. And if it fails, it gets queued up. And when the browser detects you're online again, it'll fire that sync event again and try again. And you can put logic around how many times to try and that sort of thing. And because you can store data in that database, your app could show you something like that. Like, I'm offline, I have 2 messages that are stored. And then when you sync, it could remove them from the table or whatever it's going to do, and then take that message away.
Sure.
So it doesn't do that for you, but it gives you the underlying plumbing to write that code.
Yeah. So does it give you the push notifications as well? So say that it's sent those, it could come up with a little red icon on the main icon, like a full app, and say, we've sent these, or we've just synced, and there was a couple of new messages for you, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So it's in theory. So this is one of the lesser supported features right now. And maybe I want to throw out this page while we're talking. There's a site called What Web Can Do Today, and I think we can put those links in the show notes. But
yeah, sure.
It lists all these features that the web can do or what browsers support it. And we're getting into the kind of bleeding edge side of things. But push notifications do work. Like desktop Chrome right now, you can use it, and I think the Samsung browser might support it. But they would use the same internet infrastructure like Google Cloud Messaging I've used before, and the browser would register with that to get notifications. And then when the browser gets informed, your application could come up with a push, a banner on your screen or an icon on the dashboard, Not fully supported yet, but that's kind of the direction that's going to. So it would be just like a native experience. Once you save this thing to your home screen, you wouldn't know, you would manage it in the settings and turn off notifications if you want it and that sort of thing. This is not great to date. Like I think on the devices that do support it, if you were to go to the notification settings, they're not always there yet. Like they don't treat the Progressive Web App as a first-class app yet, but that's the direction they're going as well.
Right, cool. So we touched on one phrase as well, which was a single page application. So we're all PWAs. Are they all SPAs as well?
No, and in fact, there are some folks out there that think that PWAs are going to kill SPAs.
Right.
And so they can be. So it's just a set of technologies that you can use. And so you could use Angular or Vue or React or Knockout or whatever you want to use, and cache data and do it that way, because you're telling the service worker to save, like let's say you're using, I've been playing with Vue.js. I would tell the service worker to cache the Vue.js file.
Yep.
And it would load it up and I could build my app that way. But one of the reasons we build single page apps a lot of times is that the experience of loading new pages is pretty bad, right? It's like you load a new page, it's blank, it flickers, it loads. That actually kind of goes away if everything is cached because it loads instantly. And I would not be surprised if you see some more people building traditional, multi-paged applications, because if they can load in 3 milliseconds from your cache, some of that pain goes away, and some of the complexity of using routing and all that may not actually need to be there. So you can definitely build single page apps, and you could take an existing one and do a little bit of work and make it a progressive web app. But I think I'm starting to think about, do I need all of the extra kind of junk and code and just logic around a SPA to do something that maybe is just a few web pages again?
Yeah, and that loading time is a big thing. I think one of the stats is that most people will wait 2 seconds for a page to load, and then after that, the risk of them leaving before it loads goes up exponentially. So if they've been to it once, we've got a little bit of cache in at the moment for websites, but often if you are going off and you're doing these requests in the background, that does slow the site down considerably. But if it's already cached, 3 milliseconds, people are going to really like that.
Yeah, and you get some benefits from that. Like there's a lot of stuff around SPAs, around memory leaks and things like that kind of go away if every page is a new load. So there might be some benefits there. Certainly simpler. And I think there's some cool stuff you can do with the service worker that is pretty powerful. That's sort of different, like tangential to the SPA. Like if you're reading the news apps and you get halfway through a story, potentially I could have my service worker go fetch the next one.
Yeah.
Or if I build a lot of enterprise apps, and so there's always these dashboards that somebody works off of, and it's pulling up. We pull the server every so many seconds for a new thing on the dashboard. I can write that application. So if you're an older browser, you just pull every 10 seconds. But my service worker could sit in the middle, and if it's there, it's turned on, you're on a modern browser, it could watch that and say, hey, nothing's changed for the last 10 seconds. I'm not going to send the next request. I'm going to slow down the number of polls or do something intelligent with network traffic to make this be more efficient. And that's sort of, you could do that with SPA. You could not, there's just a lot of features you could have just from the service worker on its own.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned the older browsers there. What is the browser support like for PWAs?
So it sort of depends on the piece of it. So there's the service worker component, and that is kind of supported in every evergreen browser at this point. So I think if you're using Edge, Firefox, Chrome, they pretty much work. Safari being the exception. So Safari's working on it. Mobile Safari, they've announced that it's in development, but it's not there. So in production, Chrome works great today. In Edge, there's a feature flag, and then I think in Safari, we're still waiting a little bit. So it's not great, but everyone's kind of working on it. It will never be added to IE 11 or anything like that. Now, the nice thing about this is, because it's kind of a shim that you put in, you should just build your application to work like it's online. Yep. And then when your user can suddenly support it, they get these extra features. And so it shouldn't matter, right? Because you shouldn't count on it. And that's the same thing with the other pieces of it. The manifest file that tells you what icons to use in the desktop, what the title should be, that sort of thing. If you don't have that, or your browser doesn't know it, it's still a website. It still works fine. And then if your browser supports the manifest, it gives you the option to save the desktop.
Cool. So this works on desktops as well as on mobiles, because we have been comparing it a lot to mobile apps, but it works across everything.
Yeah, that's the goal. So one of the pieces that would make this feel app-like is to have it load in a full screen without all the browser Chrome, without the header and all that. And that I think is still kind of experimental feature. I don't know. Chrome on the desktop may support that now. I'm not sure, but that is. I think all the browser vendors are focusing on mobile first, but it's in their timelines to eventually support that as well.
Yeah.
Now Microsoft has a thing called a hosted web app, which is kind of interesting. You take a web app that you have. So you build your public website, you take that, you run it through, they have a website called PWA Builder, or there's some command line stuff, and it will package that into a app you can list in the Windows App Store. But right now what it sort of does is it loads like a native shell around it, but all the code is still your website. So you can actually just publish your website to the web, point this to it, get a package that you can stick in the App Store.
I guess it'd be called, I guess it'd be what I often call a thin application. It's the actual app is nothing more than a large browser screen without all the functionality of the browser.
That's what they're doing today. What they want to do, and they announced it at the Edge Browser Summit, that they're eventually going to have Bing scrape the web, and if it finds a progressive web app and it's clear that it's a highly used one, they'll actually contact you and pull it into the App Store for you.
Oh, nice.
And then eventually they're going to get rid of the fact that you need to have that thin shell.
Yeah.
So you just not even have to be there. Right now it has to be there because otherwise the browser can't get access to some of the device APIs.
Yep.
So they do that for that shell. But they're exposing more and more of those just the browser anyway, and that'll go away.
Sure. So if I build my PWA and I take full advantage of everything that Chrome offers me, but it's stuff that isn't supported by the likes of Edge and Safari and that, but the place that I'm working, maybe they don't really understand, they don't really get it, they just want it to work like that on every browser. Are there polyfills out there for the stuff yet?
There are, so to some extent. So it's hard to polyfill the service worker. So to do all the stuff it can do, like push notifications.
Yep.
But there are polyfills that will do. They'll use the old application cache API to do some of the caching. Not great, but they do kind of work. So your users would get a better experience, but you're not quite up to modern. And that's the kind of the mindset you have to look at is. We want users on evergreen browsers, which is more and more users, to have a perfect experience. Is good enough for the other users good enough? And I think slowly people are kind of starting to become okay with that. It's hard in the enterprise, like bigger corporations, to get that idea across. But there are polyfills for that. There are, but like I said, you can't, like push notifications don't really have an equivalent. And then there are polyfills for, like if you use the Fetch API, which is kind of part of this. There's polyfills for that do traditional AJAX if you don't support it. So there's a lot of things out there that you can start writing this today, but you still have to guarantee that there's a base level web experience for anyone that doesn't have a new browser.
Sure. So if it's not fully supported yet, but will be, it's obviously worth looking into. It's obviously worth getting into because Well, one of the things I always said about the reasons creating this podcast is a lot of other podcasts just go, it's cool, and you should go and look at it because it's cool. And I'm about to say we should go and look at progressive web apps because they're cool. But because they're not fully supported, is it worth looking at with the intent to actually build something that you would put out there as a product? Or is it still more of a proof of concept framework at the moment?
So I think like service workers, the standard's finished. There's already been implementations of it. The browsers are all announcing they're going there. So it's not something where you're going to expect them to change the rules on you, right? Because you don't want to, like when like SignalR came out and Socket.io and like all the different things for WebSockets. Google had an initial launch and then they changed it and it broke a bunch of stuff.
Yep.
We're not there. So when they turn it on, it's going to be on. And the nice thing about this is you're building your website anyway. And you're going to have you're going to build your website to work in online mode when users are connected and everything. So there's no real, there's some cost in putting the service worker in place, but even if you're just caching images, you could just put a really simple one in. You start to get the, hey, snappy user interface for 30% of our users today, and no downside for the ones that don't have it. So I think there's benefits to that for that kind of stuff. Now, would I engineer push notifications for my website until I have, when no one's going to use them? Maybe, maybe not. I think you can dip your toes in the water and get some value. And if you make the experience better for 30% of your users next year, I think that's still a win, especially if it only took you, a week of work and testing to get it out. So I think it's definitely worth looking at. And the polyfill, the things that are well polyfilled, there's not much of a cost in using those today either. So like Fetch API with the polyfill is no slower than what you're doing today. It has a better syntax. It's nicer to write. I'd start using that immediately too.
Cool. So they're going to be the next big thing. Do you feel that they're going to completely replace apps on mobile phones? Do you see that sort of where it's going to go?
Not for a long time. I think there's a few reasons. One, people just want to have apps. Now, if you can get this in the App Store, I think that's going to help a lot. So, they want to be in the App Store. They want to have kind of their flagship app. I think there will always be things that you want hardware acceleration, and the web teams are making a lot of progress in there. Like Firefox just did their new release, and it's much faster, but there's going to be things that don't play well in a browser. But like for my customers, we build a lot of apps that are forms collecting some data, sticking it in a grid, and maybe there's a couple charts. And the only reason we've been building apps was because they needed offline support and a few other features. And even a couple years ago, we started doing Cordova instead of native because they didn't care, and they at least could support HTML and CSS and JavaScript. I think a lot of those apps are going to go away. The need for them is just going to vanish. And the nice thing about the enterprise for internal things is that they can dictate the platform. So if we say right now, if you say everyone has an iPad, Service Worker doesn't work.
Yep.
But if you're buying 100 Android tablets, you can just buy one that has a more modern browser and use it today. And your Salesforce now has all these Android tablets. So when you have that kind of platform control, that makes it a lot easier.
Yeah.
So I think we'll start doing these in the next year.
Cool. So it's definitely there for line of business applications, but less in the way of probably the consumer applications that are out there. It's not going to do a great deal for them at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think where you'll start to see it first will be websites that consumers go to regularly, where they're not downloading the app anyway. Like the newspaper. If the newspaper prompts you and says, hey, I can put myself on your desktop and give you a better experience, I think people will say, oh, that's interesting, and maybe accept that when they would never have gone to the App Store and searched for it.
Yeah.
I think that's where we'll see the first wins. And then if we start seeing Bing and later Google, when you search for a result, having a button there that says install the app, which I think we'll probably see in the next year, that will be a big win too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I've been toying with, at least the idea of converting the website for the podcast into a PWA, because I've been asked several times if I have a mobile app, and in all honesty, for a podcast, I don't see the benefit. And from a personal point of view, I wouldn't use it if I was listening to someone else's podcast. There's another very huge podcast that's been around for a lot longer than I have. They've got an app which I installed for it. I never listened to it. I never used it because I always use my favourite podcast app, which I use Pocket Casts, and other people go and use iTunes. They don't use the app for the podcast. So it's always been sort of like, well, no, I don't want to put the time in or the money in to pay for an app for Android, or pay for an app for iOS, pay for an app for Windows Phone and all that. But the idea was quite appealing of doing it as this PWA, and it's almost there for them. They could go to it, and maybe in the background I've said, download the latest episode when it comes in, or at least part of it, so you can start streaming it and things like that. So, do you think it could be a good candidate for this sort of technology?
I think that's a perfect example of where you'd want it, right? I agree with you. I'm not gonna download a podcast app. I'm not gonna. Every single restaurant seems to have an app, and all they have is their menu and their calendar. And I'm not going to download an app for the restaurant down the end of the street.
Yep.
But some people might, and it'd be nice to be able to offer that to them when they want it. But you're not going to maintain a separate app. So I think that's exactly the kind of use case where it makes sense for you to build that. And it's probably not a lot of work. You could probably have this be fairly useful in a small number of hours. In fact, there's an app or a Google Chrome plugin called Lighthouse.
Yep.
That you can run against your app, and I ran it against your website, and it says it gives you a score of 55, so slightly over halfway there from a progressive web app standpoint.
Oh, cool.
And then it gives you a list of the things you want to do, and most of them are going to be around. You probably don't have the service worker, so you probably don't have the caching.
Yeah.
Right. And once you take care of that, you might be 98%. It might be there. You probably just have to add the service worker and add a manifest. And Lighthouse is worth checking out because it also does accessibility and some other things. But it's there to help you kind of encourage you to see, what do I need to do? What are the 5 steps I need? And my guess is not a whole lot of work to get there.
Yeah, I shall check that out, and I shall put it on the I shall run it against the website and see how poorly I perform in some areas. But I like the idea that it's faster. The hosting that I'm using for the podcast website gives me access to HTTP2 as well. So since I actually moved it over to that host from my own dedicated box, I've actually seen that it's faster to some extent. It feels snappier on their servers.
And it makes total sense. With a lot of assets, they load up.
Yeah.
Parallel. Yeah, that makes total sense.
So adding this in again would make it even faster, and that is something that I really, really need, and might be something I suggest to a friend, because I was looking at his website. It was very, very image heavy, and some of the pages took a good 10-15 seconds to load up just because of the amount of images on there. But
yeah, that's he could do something like if everyone comes in at my homepage but they always click to this next one, maybe I go prefetch those while they're looking at the homepage.
Yeah.
And then right off the bat, a huge improvement.
Sure. So if I do want to go and convert my site into a progressive web app, where should I go? Where to start learning? Have you got any good links? Are there any courses out there that you can point us to start having a look at?
So the place I would go to start with is the Google Docs. So the developers.google.com has a huge set of things around progressive web apps because they're really pushing this. And Jake Archibald in particular from their team has a ton of content. So developers.google.com, and then they have a whole world for that. And we can put that link in the show notes. And then for the individual components, if you're looking at how does a service worker work, the best place on the web is the Mozilla developer environment, developer.mozilla.org.
Yep.
It has things about browser support. It has examples of code. And it has not just for Mozilla, like there's contributors from other browser vendors put things in here as well. So it's got kind of everything. And then if you're really going to geek out, it links right into the specs that define these things. So if you have trouble sleeping, you can click into those. So that's where I'd start. And then I do really like the Lighthouse plugin because if you're having trouble, if like you create a manifest but it doesn't work right, it'll tell you what you're doing there, like how to fix that.
Right.
So those are where I'd start. There's a lot of blog posts out there on how to get started, but the Google ones, I mean, they're kind of where this is coming from, and they do a really good job.
Sure. Cool. That's good. It's opened my eyes a little bit to it, and it's definitely pushed me to go and do something with it, because you hear about all these new technologies, and a lot of the time it's like, yeah, but have I got time to go and look at it? Is it worth looking at? And for me, this is one that's definitely stood out and gone, yes, this is something that I've definitely got a passion for. And out of all the shows I've done, I do go and have a little play and a look around, but I don't always get the chance to implement what we've talked about. There's been a few that I have. I spoke to Paul Seal from coachair.co.uk about Umbraco or Umbraco, and I took my podcast website from WordPress and built it in that. I've got another website that I run, which is about a specific type of tropical fish genus from South America, and that's written in JBake. It's a statically typed website that's baked with that. And I spoke to Jonathan Bullock from JBake about that. So I think you've sold me definitely on these progressive web apps, and I need to learn a little bit more and have a play and get the Cynical Developer website over into this new tech.
Yeah, awesome, and I'm glad I could do that. I think it's fun too. There's nothing. It's always fun to build something where you can touch it and see it interact. So like, you probably don't have a reason for a push notification, but the first time you wire one up and you actually send it and your phone lights up, it's a pretty cool feeling.
Oh yeah, definitely. A long time ago, when iPhones were very new, I built a lot of back-end stuff for applications. I wrote them in .NET, while the other guys were building the iOS stuff in Objective-C. And the first time that I got my push notification server to work was fantastic. It was such a great feeling, because you could only send so many push notifications, and if we wanted to ping all our customers on the application, I think at the time you had to ping every single one, and it used to take forever. So my application, you pinged it once and it would go out and deal with the rest of it for you. But when you see that come through, that sort of stuff is really good. I do like that. So I would take this chance to thank you for coming on and talking to us about progressive web apps.
I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thank you to you guys out there for listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Sluddart, and you've been listening to Jared Faris talking about PWAs. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website, where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.